In 1998, two Pelican Bay State Prison inmates named Paul Cornfed Schneider and Dale Bretches, who were members of the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang, decided to start a business involving breeding dogs. Paul and Dale's cell in the maximum security secure housing unit was considered the headquarters of the Aryan Brotherhood in Pelican Bay State Prison. Paul was serving a life sentence for robbery and attempted murder. He was initially sentenced for armed robbery, and later Paul joined the Aryan Brotherhood in 1987, which required him to stab a prison guard in the neck to gain acceptance into the gang. This was the act that earned him a life sentence. Transferred to Pelican Bay State Prison's maximum security facility, Paul spent most of his days in a solitary 11 by 7.5-foot cell for 22 hours. 3 years later, in 1990, Paul was scheduled to appear in court to testify in a trial, and he stabbed attorney Philip Cozens in the courtroom after smuggling in a prison knife he hid in his rectum. They figured out where Paul hid the knife because the attorney's stab wounds were infected with feces. He pleaded guilty to the stabbing, and this resulted in a second life sentence. Paul was known as a ruthless leader of the Aryan Brotherhood and was a shot caller, ordering hits inside and outside prison. Paul eventually also got charged with 7 other people. One of them was a former girlfriend, with racketeering in the attempted murders of 24 people over a 15-year period. These charges came after he was already serving his life sentence. Additionally, reports suggested that he may have been connected to a $3.6 million armored car robbery orchestrated by the Order, a white supremacist group in the 1980s. However, his exact involvement in the alleged heist remains unclear. Additionally, in 2003, he was convicted in federal court for participating in a drug smuggling operation from inside California's Pelican Bay State Prison and for participating in a 1995 armed robbery orchestrated by Aryan Brotherhood associates under Paul's orders, which resulted in the murder of a sheriff's deputy. In 2003, he received a third life sentence for that murder. Paul and Dale had invested $1,100 in books to select a breed, eventually choosing the Presa Canario. The two Aryan Brotherhood members planned on buying, raising, and breeding these dogs, who were known for their large size, weighing over 100 pounds and standing over 5 feet tall on their hind legs. Presa Canarios are massive animals bred by Spaniards as work dogs to herd bulls. They are known to run up to a bull and bite its lip or ear before dragging it to the ground by its face. They chose this breed because they didn't want, quote, sissy dogs. The inmates had a document describing the Presa Canario as, quote, a gripping dog, always used and bred for combat and guard, and used extensively for fighting. However, they both denied that their aim was to breed those animals as fighting dogs and to turn them into as scary and as large as possible. Law enforcement suspected that these dogs were going to be bred for sale to guard meth labs, which were run by the Mexican Mafia. Marjorie Ller, originally from Brooklyn, New York, was adopted by a dentist and a model-turned-housewife who held the title of Miss Brooklyn in 1936. A graduate of McGeorge School of Law in Sacramento, Marjorie became a licensed attorney in 1992 and dedicated her legal expertise to pro bono work for the homeless and individuals with AIDS. Robert Noel, a native of Baltimore, was the son of a pipe fitter and a beauty parlor owner. He graduated from the University of Baltimore Law School in 1967 and served as a tax litigation lawyer for the federal government. He later worked as an assistant U.S. attorney in San Diego before transitioning into private practice. Marjorie and Robert were both attorneys working at a San Francisco law firm when they first met and were involved in working on commercial and tax law cases. They eventually ended up getting married. In 1994, the couple took on their first prison case involving a Pelican Bay State Prison guard who faced harassment from fellow guards after he testified on behalf of inmates who were brutalized in the prison. Unfortunately, they lost the case, and their client tragically took his own life. 3 years later, they took on another prison case. However, this time they decided to represent a Pelican Bay guard who was accused of conspiring with the Aryan Brotherhood to help arrange beatings and murders. While working on this case, they met Paul Schneider in 1999, and he even testified for them. Marjorie and Robert ended up losing their second prison case as well, and they eventually started representing Paul. The couple also ended up helping out Paul and Dale with their illegal dog raising business. After Paul stabbed the lawyer in the courtroom, Paul sued the corrections system for excessively X-raying him, and he won and received a settlement of $11,666. He apparently purchased his first dog, Bane, using money from the settlement. Marjorie and Robert had invested about $20,000 into the business, supposedly from a settlement won by another inmate. Marjorie and Robert were not the typical associates of the Aryan Brotherhood. He and his wife both loved the opera and supported charitable causes like helping the homeless and mentally ill. A lawyer suggested that Robert may have been drawn to the extreme machismo and violence that Paul represented, which was very different from his privileged life. Since Paul was in solitary confinement, he needed help to run their Presa Canario business. Paul and Dale enlisted the help of outside contacts such as Brenda Story, who was an intermediary. Paul also used the Mormon missionaries who visited the prison. Janet Coombs was an unmarried Mormon woman, and she was urged by a friend to minister to inmates like Paul. Janet's friend told her that she wasn't doing her Christian duty by not going with her to the prison to help other inmates. Paul ended up romancing Janet with letters and charmed her with his words when she would visit the prison, and she fell in love with him. Janet was a single mother who lived with her daughter in Hayfork, Northern California. They got by with a disability check and income from their small farm. Over time, Paul persuaded her to care for the dogs on her farm as if they were their own kids. She agreed because she assumed that the dogs would be manageable, and also because Paul said that he would give her money for the dogs' expenses. By May 1990, Janet had 4 Presa Canarios who were named Bane, Isis, Hera, and Fury. Bane's name means killer, slayer, murderer, worker of death in Old English, and that which causes death in Old Norse. Hera was named after the Greek goddess Ares, the god of war. Janet would care for the dogs, and she would send the inmates regular updates, including details about the dogs' growth, health, and their daily behaviors, along with photographs. Paul even requested her to rub the paper on the dogs' coats so he could smell them from the prison. However, Janet eventually found herself overwhelmed by the inmates' constant demands for updates and photos. During Bane's stay on the farm, he displayed aggressive behavior. At one point, Hera and Fury escaped their fenced yard and attacked Janet's sheep, with Hera even killing at least 1 sheep and a cat belonging to Janet's daughter. Bane was also suspected of being involved in the incidents. Bane even ate his doghouse and may have killed a sheep as well. Additionally, Bane and another dog broke into her home one day, urinated to mark their territory, and ate 4 pairs of her shoes. Eventually, there were issues regarding this arrangement. Surprisingly, it wasn't Bane's behavior which caused these issues, as she loved him and affectionately referred to him as Clown. Paul said, quote, "She kept dropping hints about how she wanted me to convert to Mormon and marry her." Apparently, his refusal to do that eventually made Janet reconsider being involved in the dog breeding business. However, when Janet didn't immediately remove the dogs from her property, Paul resorted to threatening her life. He said, quote, "Things can happen to your home." In 1999, Devin Hawks, an expert on prison gangs from the California Department of Corrections, learned about the dog-raising business after Janet reported being intimidated by individuals at Pelican Bay who had co-signed several Presa Canarios to her care. This threat scared her so much, she moved out of the farm and got into the witness protection program. Devin started investigating this matter, and around the same time, Robert and Marjorie were asked by Paul to take the dogs from Janet. In October of 1999, Robert and Marjorie filed a lawsuit on behalf of Brenda Story against Janet over the ownership and custody of the 4 dogs, where they accused her of neglecting the dogs. Despite Janet not contesting the lawsuit and agreeing to give the dogs to Robert and Marjorie, she warned Marjorie about the dogs' aggressive behavior and that they had killed her sheep, but she did not seem to care. Subsequently, Marjorie contacted Dr. Donald Martin, a veterinarian who had 49 years of experience at that time, and he examined and vaccinated the dogs on March 26, 2000. With his vet bills, Dr. Martin wrote a letter to Marjorie which said the following, quote, "I would be professionally amiss if I did not mention the following, so that you can be prepared. These dogs are huge, approximately weighing in the neighborhood of 100 pounds each. They have had no training or discipline of any sort. They were a problem to even get to, let alone to vaccinate. To add to this, these animals would be a liability in any household, reminding me of the recent attack in Tiamat County to a boy by large dogs. He lost his arm and disfigured his face," unquote. Marjorie expressed gratitude to Dr. Martin for sharing the information, assuring him that she would relay it to her client. Dr. Martin was personally very concerned over Bain's influence on the other dogs. He said, quote, "Dogs are basically primordial pack animals. These dogs reacted like they were on a hunting trip. One reacts, they all will follow. It's like a feeding frenzy." He stated that in a pack, Bain would be the king. Quote, "He had that kind of attitude. He would be the top dog." On the other hand, Dr. Martin described Hera as a fear biter, unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Quote, "She was growling and snapping. I just felt Hera was a dog I couldn't be sure about." On April 1st, 2000, both Robert and Marjorie, along with a professional dog handler, assumed custody of Bain and Hera from Janet. At that time, Bain weighed 150 pounds and Hera weighed 130 pounds, and both dogs had inch-long fangs. Along with her previous warnings, Janet told Robert and Marjorie that Hera and Fury should be put down. Janet blamed the dog's aggressive behavior on Paul as he allegedly discouraged socializing the animals. Following the handover, Hera spent a brief period at a kennel in San Mateo County, while Bain was taken to a facility in Los Angeles County. Robert and Marjorie soon became concerned for the health of the dogs, and on April 30th, 2000, they brought Hera to their sixth-floor apartment at 2398 Pacific Avenue in San Francisco, and Bain was brought into the apartment on September 2000. Robert then purchased dog licenses, officially registering himself and Marjorie as the dog's owners. Robert and Marjorie frequently exchanged letters with Paul and Dale. From March to December 2000, over 100 letters were exchanged between them under the guise of attorney-client communications. Within these letters, discussions revolved around a potential commercial breeding operation, proposing names for the business like Gerahund Kennels and War Dog. They eventually settled on Doggo War. On a website dedicated to the business, Paul and Dale referred to Bain as War Dog and described him as the bringer of death, ruin, destruction. Between the dog's relocation to the apartment in San Francisco in January 26, 2001, there were approximately 30 documented instances of the dogs being out of control and displaying aggressive behavior towards humans and other dogs. Neighbors reported seeing the dogs unattended on the sixth floor, sometimes running down the hall without supervision. Robert's letters with Paul confirmed these occurrences, mentioning an incident where Marjorie lost control of the dogs as they sprinted down the hall. Robert vividly described the event, mentioning how the dogs pushed past him and, quote, took off side by side down the hall toward the elevator in a celebratory stampede. 240 pounds of presa wall-to-wall moving at top speed, unquote. In a letter written by Marjorie to Paul, she admitted that she did not have the upper body strength to control Bain and also had trouble controlling and handling Hera. When neighbors complained to Robert and Marjorie about the behavior of the dogs, they didn't seem to care. They either responded callously to the neighbors or just simply ignored them. One incident involved neighbors Stephen and Amy West. Stephen and Amy were walking their dog in a nearby park when their dog was attacked by Hera. During the attack, Hera latched onto the snout of the West's dog. Robert could not control Hera and was unable to separate the dogs. This prompted Amy to throw her keys at Hera, which startled her and caused her to release her grip on their dog. On a separate occasion, Stephen West was walking his dog when he saw Robert and Bain. Bain attempted to lunge towards the West's dog but was pulled back by Robert. After these two separate incidents, Stephen approached Robert and suggested muzzling the dogs and consulting Mario Montepique, a dog trainer. Robert dismissed the idea and said that there was no need to do so. Robert and Marjorie were advised by dog trainer Mario Montepique to have their dogs trained and to use a choke collar, but they chose to ignore this recommendation. In a different incident, Lynn Gaines, a dog walker who was walking a dog, advised Robert to put a muzzle on Bain. Robert replied by calling her a bitch and said that the dog she was walking was the problem, and not the dog he admitted he couldn't control. David Moser lived in the same apartment building, and as he passed by Robert and Marjorie in the hallway, Hera bit him on the rear end. When he told them that their dog bit him, Robert replied, interesting. Neither of them tried to discipline the dog or even apologize to their neighbor. Another neighbor, Jill Cowan Davis, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, was growled at by one of the dogs, and it also lunged towards her stomach with its mouth open and teeth bared in the presence of Robert and Marjorie. Although the dog was leashed, and Robert quickly intervened by jerking the dog by the leash, he did not apologize to her. Postal carrier John Watanabe was attacked by both dogs who were unleashed. They charged at him in a snarling frenzy, and he was terrified for his life. Fortunately, the dogs went back to Marjorie and Robert when John stepped behind his mail cart. Another incident involved the dogs lunging at a 6-year-old boy on his way to school. The dogs were less than a foot from the boy when they were stopped.
He began to put his hand out, and the other dog lunged.
All of a sudden, I hear this snarling. I just looked up and saw these dogs coming straight towards me.
One of the dogs lunged at my son.
Robert himself suffered a serious injury to his finger during a fight between Bain and another dog. During the altercation, Bain bit Robert, resulting in him getting surgery and having to wear a splint on his arm. He also had 2 steel pins placed in his hand for 8 to 10 weeks. Diane Whipple was a 33-year-old college lacrosse coach from Long Island, New York, and a talented marathon runner. She was a former National Player of the Year in lacrosse at Pennsylvania State University, where she earned the nickname the Whip. Despite trying to make the Olympic track team, she was unsuccessful. After settling in San Diego, she survived thyroid cancer and later met her partner, Sharon Smith, who was an investment company manager. The couple were together for 7 years during this time, and they both lived in a 6th-floor apartment across the lobby from Robert and Marjorie. Sharon encountered the dogs frequently, sometimes as often as once a week. Diane was afraid of the Presa Canarios, a sentiment shared by many tenants in her building and residents of the Pacific Heights neighborhood. In early December 2000, Diane contacted Sharon, who was at work, in a panic after one of the dogs lunged at her and bit her hand in the lobby. Despite sustaining 3 deep red indentations on her hand, she did not immediately seek medical attention. She instead took precautions to avoid the dogs by checking the hallway before leaving their apartment, and she became anxious while waiting for the elevator, fearing that she may run into the dogs. Diane and Sharon did not complain to the apartment management because they wanted nothing to do with Robert and Marjorie. On January 26, 2001, Diane called Sharon and informed her that she was heading home early. She was returning from a grocery shopping trip for a home dinner with Sharon. In January 2001, stockbroker Bill Quenzi was visiting a friend who also lived in the apartment building at 2398 Pacific Avenue. On January 26th, at around 4 p.m., as he was unlocking his friend's 3rd-story apartment door, he suddenly heard a woman's frantic screams. He said, quote, "It was high-pitched, desperate, continuous screaming of a woman who was obviously being attacked. I knew I had to do something, and I tried to call 911 on my cell phone. Despite trying to call 911 on his cell phone, he realized there was no signal where he was standing. In an attempt to get better reception, Bill made his way to the stairs and started climbing to where the screams were coming from. He continued until he reached the 5th floor, and when he realized that the screaming was coming from the 6th floor, he stopped out of fear. He stated, quote, "I assumed it was a domestic violence situation, or a woman being sexually assaulted. I realized that when I climbed to the 6th floor landing, I would be exposed to the situation, which I knew was violent, and I was scared." As Bill was going down the stairs, he was finally able to call the police. When he reached the ground floor, he heard the woman's cries turn into a low moan, and the screaming eventually stopped. Around the same time, a neighbor named Esther Berkmeyer, who lived across the hall from Diane, heard dogs barking and a woman's panic-stricken voice calling, "Help me! Help me!" While looking through the peephole of her front door, what Esther witnessed was extremely distressing. She saw Diane lying face down just over the threshold of her apartment, with what seemed to be a dog on top of her. Seeing no one else in the hallway, Esther hesitated to open the door as she was scared, and immediately called 911 for help, all while hearing a voice yelling, "No, no, no," and "Get off." As Esther approached her door, she could hear barking and growling directly outside. She also heard something banging against a door outside. She again heard a voice yell, "Get off, get off. No, no, stop, stop." She was so afraid that she chained her door. She then looked through her peephole again, and she could not see Diane anymore. However, she did notice groceries scattered in the hallway. Concerned, Esther made a second call to 911.
911, we have two dogs rampaging out in the hall, up on the 6th floor, and I think they have even their owner cannot control them. They are huge. Please hurry. I hear screaming, and I don't dare open the door. These dogs are ferocious.
San Francisco police officers Sidney Laws and Leslie Forrestal arrived at 2398 Pacific Avenue at 4:12 p.m. First responders discovered Diane on the 6th floor hallway in a horrific state. Her clothing had been completely ripped off and she was covered in severe wounds and bleeding profusely. She was desperately trying to crawl to her open apartment door in a pool of blood. Officers had radioed for backup before giving Diane first aid. Patrol Sergeant Leslie Forrestal said, quote, "We were afraid for our lives. We saw what the dogs had done to her, and we didn't know whether we would be attacked too. I radioed that I was going to shoot on sight," unquote.
Be advised, we're going to, fire as soon as we see it.
The officers then called for an ambulance as they assessed the situation.
Code 3 for serious dog bite wounds. We're going to need an ambulance.
Shortly after Sergeant Forrestal's call for help, more police officers and paramedics rushed to the scene. Robert was out of town during this time, and Marjorie was seen getting out of her apartment, showing no care or concern for Diane, and claiming to officers that she was searching for her keys, which she found just inside the door to Diane's apartment. She had blood on her sweatshirt, hair, and face. Marjorie also had small cuts on 2 fingers of one hand, which she claimed she had suffered while trying to stop the attack. First aid was given to Diane by an emergency medical technician. Diane had suffered a significant, profusely bleeding neck wound which was too large to stop the bleeding. As the paramedics arrived, Diane's pulse and breathing stopped. She was revived. However, Diane's injuries were too severe, and she could not be saved. Diane passed away in the emergency room just 70 minutes after the attack. An autopsy later revealed that Diane suffered 77 injuries covering her body. Every inch of Diane's body was covered with wounds, except the soles of her feet and the top of her head. The most significant were lacerations severing her jugular vein, damaging her carotid artery, and crushing her larynx to asphyxiate her, injuries typically inflicted by predatory animals to kill their prey. Medical experts stated that Diane had lost 1/3 or more of her blood at the scene. The medical examiner stated that even if she received medical attention earlier, she would have still succumbed to her injuries due to the extreme blood loss. Plaster molds of the 2 dogs' teeth showed that the bite marks on her neck matched those of Bain's. At the scene, Animal Control Officer Andrea Runge approached Marjorie and requested her to sign over custody of the dogs to get euthanized. Marjorie, who Andrea found to be oddly calm, agreed to surrender Bain, but refused to sign over Hera for euthanasia, and she refused to help the animal control officers with the animals, saying she was unable to handle the dogs. Michael Scott, the second animal control officer who arrived at the apartment, described the scene. He said, quote, "I was told that the bigger of the 2 dogs, Bain, was in the bathroom. I could hear him, panting, snarling and pacing behind the bathroom door. The bathroom door was being covered by a police officer with a machine gun, backed up by another officer with a drawn gun," unquote. 2 other officers had their guns drawn outside the door to the bedroom where Hera was. She was bashing the door from the inside, and due to her size and strength, Michael was afraid that the door might give way. Michael cracked the bathroom door and shot 2 tranquilizer darts at Bain. However, they malfunctioned and had no effects on him, and officers were not able to calm him down. Animal control officers, with support from the other officers who were armed with guns, resorted to using a come-along to subdue the dog, which is a device which works like a leash but is made with a steel braid loop. Michael said, quote, "When I tried to move the dog, he rushed me and almost knocked me off my feet. I was lucky I was wearing a bulletproof vest. It took all my strength to force him with the come-along away from the door opening and shut the door," unquote. Similarly, officers used the same method to control Hera. Michael waited until a 3rd animal control officer arrived, allowing the 2 of them to successfully control Bain using 2 come-alongs before ultimately putting him down. Hera, whose role in the mauling has never been firmly established, was held by San Francisco Animal Care and Control pending a dangerous dog hearing. She was put down later on in January. Following Diane's tragic death, over 40 individuals contacted the San Francisco Police Department to report prior aggressive encounters with the present scenarios involving themselves, their children, or their pets. Many had stayed silent out of fear of Marjorie and Robert. Robert and Marjorie made frequent media appearances in an attempt to exonerate themselves, making several controversial statements. Both Robert and Marjorie showed no remorse for the brutal death of Diane, and merely viewed her death as little more than an inconvenience. Robert, in an interview on Primetime Live, claimed that Bane was a really gentle dog.
So he's not a vicious dog in your estimation?
No, he wasn't a vicious dog. He had some issues with other male dogs, as other male dogs had issues with him. They bark at one another, they might lunge for one another, but no, Bane had never shown any signs of people aggression.
On February 8, 2001, both Robert and Marjorie made an appearance on the TV show Good Morning America and stated, quote, "I wouldn't say it was an attack. Bane was just overly interested in Miss Whipple," unquote. She also blamed Diane for the dog's mauling and eventually killing her. Marjorie claimed that Diane had apparently already had her apartment door open when something about her interested the dog. Apparently Bane had broke away, dragged Marjorie across the lobby, and jumped up on Diane, putting his paws on either side of her. Marjorie said that in an attempt to protect Diane, she pushed her inside her open apartment, fell on top of her, and tried to shield Diane with her own body. However, the dog misinterpreted Diane's movements, and the dog started to bite Diane after she hit Marjorie with her fist. Marjorie argued that Diane had so many opportunities to either close the door of her apartment or stay still on the floor to prevent the attack. Robert also made digs at Diane's sexual orientation, insinuating that she may have incited Bane to attack her by wearing a pheromone perfume or by using steroids. Prosecutor James Hammer admitted that the death of Diane may not have been investigated as a crime if it were not for Robert and Marjorie's public statements. The public's outrage to these statements led to so many reports of previous incidents involving the dogs, and the revelation of a connection between Robert and Marjorie and the Aryan Brotherhood further fueled the public's outrage. Additionally, 4 days after Diane's death, it had come out that Robert and Marjorie had legally adopted 38-year-old Paul Schneider. All of this led to immediate pressure to conduct a criminal investigation. This investigation revealed evidence that the dogs were always dangerous and a threat to everyone around them. It also revealed that 2 weeks before the vicious mauling, Robert wrote to Paul in prison about an incident which happened at the apartment where both dogs scared Diane and almost knocked her down. Robert mocked Diane and described her as, quote, "a timorous little mousy blonde who almost had a coronary during the incident." It seemed like both Robert and Marjorie enjoyed the fear that their dogs caused. The couple's apartment was described as a charming flat. However, the dogs turned it into a piss pot. In the apartment, the police discovered a book titled Manstopper, which detailed instructions on training a killer dog. Some experts speculate that they had trained their dogs using a technique called rag biting. This technique involves using a rag and encouraging the dog to bite the rag and hold onto it. And through repeated sessions, the dog learns to bite harder. This could possibly explain how the dogs ripped off Diane's clothing. Additionally, the authorities found that Paul had topless photos of Marjorie in his cell. The authorities also had a search warrant to look for photos allegedly showing Marjorie engaging in inappropriate activities with the dogs. Marjorie refuted the bloody pictures mentioned in the police search warrant, but did admit to sending nude photos to her client and also adopted son. In an interview with Rolling Stone, she said, quote, "Paul has an inner life he shares with us. He's special. He's our kid. And we love him," unquote. Additionally, Marjorie mentioned sending erotic letters to inmates, saying, quote, "It's a tradition to write erotic letters to inmates. It helps them. I flashed my breasts in some pictures. Bob might have sent one of these to Paul. There was nothing with dogs," unquote. However, in a letter to Paul, Marjorie did once brag that Bane was her, quote, "certified lick therapist." Keith Whitley, a former Pelican Bay State Prison guard, was quoted in Rolling Stone magazine saying, quote, "I'd get on the phone with Bob to ask him about a case, and all he did was talk about how big Bane's balls were." Robert himself bragged to a magazine about the dog's private parts. Robert told a reporter from Rolling Stone, quote, "Bane was confident, proud, handsome. Bane had an eye for ladies." He sees Marjorie, rolls over on his back, and bam, that big red arrow popped out, unquote. Paul's prison artwork often featured a partially nude Marjorie alongside the large dogs. It seemed like Marjorie was attracted to Paul, and her husband didn't seem to mind. He even wrote about his wife in a sexual manner to the Aryan Brotherhood boss in his letters. Devon Hawks believed that Marjorie had fallen in love with Paul. Marjorie described Paul as handsome, articulate, intelligent, and charming, and Robert described him as a man of character. If you treat him with respect, he treats you with respect. The case only turned into a murder case following Robert and Marjorie's testimonies to the grand jury, who were appalled by a particular statement that Marjorie made. During grand jury proceedings, Marjorie claimed she tried to save Diane, but then made a disrespectful remark about Bain sniffing Diane's crotch like she was a bitch in heat. During grand jury testimony, Robert acknowledged that Diane feared the dogs. The murder trial started in January 2002 and was moved to Los Angeles due to extensive pre-trial media coverage in San Francisco. Robert chose not to testify, but he presented evidence highlighting positive interactions between the dogs and various individuals, including veterinarians, friends, and neighbors. However, despite Robert and Marjorie portraying their dogs as peaceful with no history of violence, evidence of over 30 incidents involving the dogs and their aggressive behavior towards other neighbors contradicted their claims. One of their neighbors even had a nickname for one of the dogs, which was Dog of Death. Attorney Nedra Ruiz represented Marjorie, and she attempted to downplay the significance of the couple's ties to the Aryan Brotherhood. Attorney Ruiz painted Robert and Marjorie as upstanding citizens dedicated to social causes and loving pet owners. She stated that the couple had gotten acquainted with both Paul and Dale through their commitment to individuals' rights, which began with representing prison guards against the California Department of Corrections. Over time, this evolved into representing prisoners in lawsuits against both prison guards and the department. However, their history was obviously mischaracterized in court. Marjorie did end up testifying, which lasted over 12 hours. She portrayed herself, her husband, and Paul as really close, referring to them as the triad, and Paul as her son. Marjorie denied reading the books which were found in the apartment that had warnings about the dog's vicious nature, and she believed that professionally training the dogs was unnecessary as she didn't perceive any personality issues with the dogs. She maintained that no one had warned her about the dog's behavior, and that most witnesses who testified about the dog's behavior, such as Jill Cowan Davis, who was 8 months pregnant at the time the dog lunged at her stomach, were lying. While expressing remorse to the family of Diane, Marjorie maintained that her dogs have never been aggressive and attributed any inconsistencies in her statements to poor memory. Marjorie testified saying, quote, "He wasn't making aggressive moves. He was just really interested. I don't know if there was something in the grocery bags or something about Miss Whipple," unquote. Marjorie also claimed that she never walked both dogs at the same time, mentioning that normally she would walk Hera while Robert handled Bain, because she did not have the upper body strength to control Bain. At the time of the attack, Bain was a 140-pound male, and Hera was a 115-pound female. Marjorie was a petite woman, and Bain weighed more than she did. After Robert got hurt during the incident where he was breaking up the fight between Bain and another dog, Marjorie started walking Bain while keeping him on a leash, and during the day of the attack, she said that she decided to take both dogs out at the same time. During the time of the fatal mauling, Robert was out of town. Marjorie mentioned that just before the attack on Diane, she had just finished walking Bain on the rooftop of their apartment building. After returning to her apartment and opening the door while holding Bain's leash, he unexpectedly charged towards Diane, dragging Marjorie behind him down the hall towards Diane, who had just unlocked her apartment door and set one grocery bag inside her apartment. Diane was viciously mauled by Bain, and Hera then left Marjorie's apartment, and according to Marjorie's testimony, Hera started tearing off Diane's clothing. Marjorie stated that she acted quickly by throwing herself onto Diane to protect her, and she denied that Hera was involved in the attack. However, she admitted to not calling 911 for help during the 10-minute attack. Attorney Nedra Ruiz had a very unconventional approach during the trial. In one instance, she got down on all fours to mimic how Marjorie tried to stop the mauling. Attorney Ruiz even asked Janet to demonstrate how high Bain could reach on his hind legs, and after Janet stood up, Ruiz came forward and said, quote, "I know the prosecution is going to say this is typecasting. I'm going to be the dog," unquote. Janet said that Bain could get high enough to lick her face. Attorney Ruiz asked, "Could we not do that, Your Honor?" The judge then promptly stopped the demonstration. Jury foreman Don Newton described Attorney Ruiz as an amazingly dramatic person and an incredible actress. When questioned on the stand about her responsibility for the attack on Diane, Marjorie responded saying, quote, "I said in an interview that I wasn't responsible, but it wasn't in regard to what Bain had done. It was in regard to knowing whether he would do that or not. And I had no idea that he would ever do anything like that to anybody. How can you anticipate something like that? It's a totally bizarre event. I mean, how could you anticipate that a dog that you know that is gentle and loving and affectionate would do something so horrible and brutal and disgusting and gruesome to anybody? How could you imagine that happening?" Unquote. Dr. Randall Lockwood, the prosecution's expert on dog behavior, testified that a dog's good behavior at times does not guarantee that the dog will not be aggressive and violent in different situations. He also stressed the importance of properly training dogs like Bain and Hera. Marjorie also had bruising on her hands and other minor injuries on the day of the fatal mauling, and in response to her testimony, the prosecution presented evidence suggesting that Marjorie's injuries had indicated that she had not been as involved in trying to protect Diane as she had claimed. However, her attorney was convinced that the jury was going to think that Marjorie had acted heroically. Prosecutors also presented gruesome testimony about Diane's injuries, including enlarged photographs that disturbed many spectators, resulting in them leaving the courtroom. During cross-examination, Attorney Ruiz tried to show that the police were negligent in not taking immediate action to stop the bleeding. However, it was acknowledged that applying direct pressure to the wounds might have helped, but it would be highly unlikely that Diane would have survived due to her losing 1/3 or more of her blood. The jury ultimately found Marjorie Noller guilty of second-degree murder, as well as both Marjorie and Robert Noel guilty of involuntary manslaughter and owning a dangerous animal that led to the death of a human being. Jury foreman Don Newton said, quote, "From our point of view, her testimony was not believable. That was crucial to our decision in coming to second-degree murder." Another juror, Jean Sluiman, said Marjorie's testimony was not believable and that it had a lot of inconsistencies. Robert refused to stand as the jury entered the courtroom to deliver the verdict, and after hearing of the convictions, he had no visible reaction. Marjorie, on the other hand, gasped, winced, and looked down when the jury returned the verdicts. Later, she turned and mouthed help to her parents who were sitting in the back of the courtroom. Following the verdict, both Robert and Marjorie sought a new trial. However, the motion filed by Robert was denied by the trial court. The trial judge granted Marjorie a new trial for the second-degree murder charge based on his interpretation of implied malice murder standards. Marjorie ended up receiving a 4-year prison sentence for involuntary manslaughter on July 15, 2002. The state contested the judge's decision and aimed to reinstate the second-degree murder conviction. After both Marjorie and Robert were convicted in 2002, their law licenses were suspended by the State Bar of California. Marjorie resigned from the bar in January 2007, while Robert was disbarred a month later in February. Robert was released from prison on parole on September 14, 2003, and by 2004, both Marjorie and Robert had completed their sentences for manslaughter, with Marjorie being out on bail pending the appeal of her second-degree murder conviction. In May 2005, the state appellate court determined that for implied malice murder, it was not necessary to have knowledge of a high probability of death, but rather to exhibit a conscious disregard for serious bodily injury. As a result, the case was sent back to the lower court for further consideration. Marjorie then appealed the appellate court decision to the Supreme Court of California, who on June 1, 2007, disagreed with the Court of Appeals decision, stating that implied malice murder required proof that the defendant acted with a conscious disregard for human life. Hence, the case was sent back to the trial court to reassess Marjorie's second-degree murder conviction in light of this new interpretation. Following this, the San Francisco Superior Court reinstated Marjorie's conviction for second-degree murder, and she was sentenced to 15 years to life on September 22, 2008. Marjorie then appealed the trial court's decision, but on August 23, 2010, the First District Court of Appeal upheld her conviction unanimously, concluding that her actions showed a conscious disregard for human life. The California Supreme Court declined to review this decision, and Marjorie is currently serving her sentence at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. In November 2015, Marjorie sought to overturn her second-degree murder conviction by petitioning the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, which upheld her conviction in February 2016. Marjorie's initial parole application in February 2019 was denied. Her parole hearing in December 2021 was rescheduled twice until February 15, 2023, where her parole was ultimately denied due to concerns about her potential risk to society. She will next be eligible for parole in 2026 when she will be around 70 to 71 years old. Following his release from prison, Robert worked as a baker in Fairfield, California, and lived in a small apartment in the area. In the same year, Robert expressed unwavering support for Marjorie, stating he would stand by her until his last breath. He said, quote, "I'm here after 15 years, not leaving her now." By the fall of 2016, Robert's life seemed to be in turmoil as he faced various health issues and found himself living in a van before relocating to the San Diego area. He said that he wanted to die, but that he was still happy that he still had his service animal dog with him. However, in late 2016, he fell into a deep depression after having to part with the dog. Robert passed away from heart failure in a La Jolla nursing home on his 77th birthday on June 22, 2018. Sharon Smith, Diane's partner, successfully sued Marjorie and Robert for $1.5 million in damages. The San Francisco Superior Court recognized Sharon as Diane's domestic partner, allowing her to bring the lawsuit under the Equal Protection Clause. She later donated a portion of the settlement to St. Mary's College of California to support the women's lacrosse team. Thank you for watching.